Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of MIP. I'm here with my friend Jared Morningstar. Jared works for the Center for Process Studies and the Cobb Institute, where he supports these organizations promote a process relational worldview and flourish in a digital world through aiding in a variety of marketing and communication tasks. He also works for the Psychedelic Medicine Association, where he helps communicate the latest insights in psychedelic research for mental health conditions to an audience of clinicians and other healthcare professionals. Jared is also the founder and director of, is it Aleph? Aleph, Traditional Wisdom in Review, a digital Islamic studies publication which seeks to build intellectual and spiritual bridges between the Islamic tradition and Western cultural, religious, and philosophical sources. Well, that sounds very juicy, Jared, and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, man, thanks. Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for such a warm welcome. And wow, you really are juicing me up here right off the bat. So
I try, I do what I can, you know. But yeah, I mean, I thought I'd record a conversation with you because I've kind of been collaborating and communicating with you about various topics. I think more along the political and philosophical lines, but also we have kind of parallel interests, I think, in religion and spirituality and this whole, all this constellation of different communities and idea spaces. So I just thought, let's talk and see what comes up. But I want to start about how I first met you and reached out to you. And it was on Facebook, and we were Facebook friends. And you had written, I think, on your story on Facebook, something about Jordan Peterson and what he was talking about, in his book, 12 More Rules, I think, about abandoning ideology, right? I think it's chapter 6 in that book. He has an entire chapter called Abandon Ideology. And I had just written a Medium article where I basically critiqued that whole chapter from a meta-ideological perspective. And what you had written on your Facebook story was like identical to what I had just written. And I was like, this is wild. I got to reach out to this guy and see, what's making him tick here and what's behind this critique and kind of explore the consonance between, what I've been trying to develop with this project and what you had just spit out there randomly on a Facebook story. So I want to start there. So tell me if you can remember, what inspired that little rant of yours, the critique of that chapter, and what was your thinking behind it?
yeah, I think honestly, I just saw on Jordan Peterson's own social media feed like a very abridged version of what he must have written in the chapter of the book, and just sort of it didn't sit well with me, and I decided to respond. And I remember I was in Goodwill thrifting some clothes, and I was waiting in line, and I just on the Facebook story sort of responded to Jordan Peterson quick there. But the basic idea that I was trying to communicate against his thesis that, you got to get out of ideology, you got to let go of these sort of structures of thought that control you, this type of thinking is basically that there's not really a way to get out of ideology. What he was saying there had an ideological bent to it, one specifically in this sort of conservative vein that doesn't want life to get overly politicized and wants to focus more on individual virtue rather than thinking more systemically, politically about the various issues that we face today. So yeah, I commented, you can't really get out of this ideological game, but I also said that that's not exactly this iron cage that people make it out to be. You can have healthy and unhealthy ideology, and that's going to be judged by various metrics depending on your ideology and other values. But also that life can't be reduced to the ideological dimension, just like you can't reduce life to the biological dimension or the psychological dimension, even though these things also touch everything, more or less. You can't escape psychology, you can't escape biology. I think people would generally find that pretty uncontroversial, but I'd say the same for ideology. You can't escape it. So try to work with it almost like alchemically or something instead. See what can be made of it. To take a kind of pragmatic approach that this is a domain of life that we got to deal with one way or another. So might as well try and figure out some tools and techniques for being able to navigate this space fluidly and with flexibility. And certainly that's very much what you're doing here with the Meta-Ideological politics project. So
yeah, awesome. There was a particular part of that story that you wrote that I really resonated with a lot, which is that the danger of a anti-ideological ideology or anti-ideological stance is that you become blind to your own ideological biases, right? When you think that you're beyond ideology, when you think you don't have ideology, you then lack a conceptual mechanism with which to reflect on your own ideology. And so it's kind of, I make a joke of like, it kind of parallels in an interesting way the conversation around like anti-racism, right? The talking point there being that if we were not talking consciously about race and critically inspecting our own socialized biases around race, then you become blind to your own implicit biases and kind of racist behaviors that you may be enacting, right? So it's kind of a similar parallel, I think, but much more abstract and much more high level, where it's like, any kind of frame that you use to understand socio-political, economic, cultural systems and issues is kind of what I would call an ideology, right? That probably informs the specific issue positions that you take or policies that you support or candidates you vote for, but there's still some kind of like backdrop, right, that informs the more particular points of your political belief system. And so when we're not talking about ideology consciously, then it's very easy to fall into this polarizing accusation of you are ideological in the most pejorative, condescending, derisive way possible. Well, I am not, right? I'm seeing reality clearly, objectively, and practically, and in a common sense way, and you're just ideologically delusional. And that's a very unproductive form of conversation that we get locked into in all this polarization, right? So I really liked that part of like talking about ideology critically so that we can reflect on it and then kind of work with these heuristics, work with these systems of thought, work with these lenses consciously, develop a healthy relationship to them, and then cultivate them in a way to better grok this incredible complexity that we're all, swimming in.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like you want to be able to look at your ideology and not always through your ideology. But that task becomes basically impossible if you say that you don't have an ideology or that you're somehow beyond this. And so then your critical eye can be all the more stringent against others who are stuck in this ideological game, but you have very few tools for sort of critical self-reflection, which I mean is very necessary for productive conversation, as you say. You have so many people stuck in this. Well, my tribe's right. My political beliefs are the ones that shall bring about the proper socio-political economic situation. And if we could just all hop on this bandwagon together, then things will be hunky-dory. But I mean, pragmatically, it's not going to happen. You got to actually have a good dialogue across political lines, and sort of the critical self-reflection is going to be a key component to making that healthy and productive, certainly.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm going to go back to what you said, though, that with the caveat of this critique of not everything can be reduced to ideology, that right there are certain dimensions of reality or other categories through which we should capture, understand something without overly ideologizing them or framing them as exclusively ideological in the political sense. So I'm curious on where you kind of draw that line between this is ideological or this has ideological implications, but this can't be reduced to being ideological and should be maybe captured or understood in a different way. And to me, it kind of relates to one of the polarizing debates in the culture war of what should be considered political and what is not political, right? And given that ideology tends to be associated with it's associated with the political sphere. And like, with all the recent mass shootings, for example, the school shooting, there's always that debate, like, don't politicize this, don't turn this into a political issue. But then other people are saying, but this is a political issue, right? Everything is political. We're all entangled in this system that contains politics. So politics does have an influence on everything, whether we like it or not, right? So how do you think about drawing that line and when you think of something as ideological and when you think of something that's not ideological?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things I've really noticed in the wake of this shooting is, like you're saying, all this rhetoric about, oh, don't politicize it. But man, is that ever itself a political talking point? Oh boy, look at my political enemies, reducing this tragic moral event to its political dimensions to sort of bolster their tribe and their agenda. And so, yeah, I mean, again, it's like turtles all the way down when you're critiquing the overly political machinations of your enemies. You're involved in your own very political machinations. But yeah, when do you use the ideological sort of frame on things? I'd certainly say anytime someone is presenting a sort of specific political vision, or when someone is critiquing another political vision. I think that's probably some situation where it'd be useful to take a sort of ideological analysis type of perspective. But yeah, again, I'd say don't reduce it to that, and especially when you're having sort of a one-on-one conversation with someone or trying to engage in some kind of dialogue. Oftentimes presenting that kind of analysis explicitly can just kind of muddy the waters a bit, like trying to just analyze away your interlocutor's sort of viewpoints, often not helpful, but doing that analysis internally so that you can then sort of have a better understanding or empathy for what kinds of political values are driving these individuals, or kind of what kind of political logic they use to analyze situations. Well, that's very helpful, because then you can draw on some of those same resources to present a different perspective, or draw out sort of implicit implications of their own ideas that might connect and build bridges in helpful ways. So yeah, I personally, I think taking this more stepping back and having this kind of ideological analysis is very good for, like, if you're blogging, writing an article. It can be very helpful to sort of lay out how you're going about that analysis for others to see. I'm not sure doing it explicitly sort of in a dialogue about political issues is necessarily always the most helpful. And then again, of course, it's one of many sort of frames that you can take. So looking at the psychological as well, what kinds of sort of internal values might be at work, or kind of non-political but personal biases that a person might have. Those are certainly helpful as well. Taking a sort of worldview, religious kind of lens can kind of be very related to some of the ideological stuff, but also expand it a bit more beyond the purely political. So yeah, there's a lot of tools in the toolbox, and you got to be you got to have your finger on the pulse a bit to really know what might be the right route in a given situation, in terms of figuring out sort of your own analysis, but then what would be kind of pragmatic for having a healthy dialogue.
You know, we call this the Meta-Ideological Politics podcast, but a more accurate name would actually be like meta frame. It's just not as sexy, like it doesn't have the juice of ideological. So for pragmatic and strategic reasons, I went with ideological, but it's more that recognizing that the frame of reference, however you want to call it, whether it's a certain discipline like psychology or a biology or philosophy or whatever, really informs your thinking about the subject, or informs what opinion you have on the issue. And that we should try to recognize those frames often when they're implicit, because I notice that in a lot of conflict and a lot of mediation work that I do, there's a clash of frames. And for example, I was mediating a conflict around like race and social justice issues, and so one party was really strong and really strident on the kind of anti-racist social justice, like woke perspective or standpoint, and the person they were in conflict with was really getting annoyed by that. And the frame that the person they were in conflict with was coming from was more, I would call it psychological and like organizational development. That was like their lens. And the other party was really coming from a more of a the kind of social justices, I would say it's more like sociological, right? So talking about like power dynamics between different identity groups, right? And talking about your kind of socialized conditioning and positionality that has to do with the race that creates a kind of bias or prejudice or de facto racism, right? It's more sociological. And the other person didn't really come from a sociological frame. They were coming from a psychological and organizational development frame. And so those two frames were clashing, but they weren't really aware that those were the underlying frames they were coming from. It was more like, you're a bad person, you're a racist, and we're just going to fight and fight. So to me, part of the meta-ideological task is to also kind of unearth that there is an implicit framework that both parties are coming from that contain its own values, that contains its own kind of like life world, so to speak, right? And we should understand those things on their own terms instead of only looking at them through one lens, which from that perspective might write off or dismiss or just think the other person can be wrong, right? So that's kind of how I think about meta-ideological and not reducing everything to ideology, is because whatever frame that could also be captured by, I would also want to integrate into the toolkit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting figuring out these sorts of diplomatic moves one can make in these spaces. I don't know exactly how I sort of came upon these types of perspectives, but certainly in sort of early to mid 2010s, when kind of the sort of SJW stuff was really big. I did notice some like personal discomfort with like how some of these talking points were metered out. I had some empathy for people like Jordan Peterson who were critiquing these perspectives, and so I kind of started to think about how I would go about this as well. But I have a very sort of diplomatic or sort of non-confrontational kind of disposition to myself. So I'm not gonna be sort of owning the SJWs and destroying them a la Ben Shapiro. I really do want to kind of draw out some of the implications, see where some of the natural dissonances are with some of the other values that people might hold. So yeah, I started to critique some of this stuff, not in particularly strong sort of denunciatory terms, but I noticed that when I took a perspective that wasn't so harsh as people like Peterson or Shapiro, I didn't really have blowback in the same way that a lot of these conservative commentators were really complaining about. I have never felt worried about being canceled, but I'm also not any kind of serious public figure. And I've spoken rather freely about these types of issues. So I guess just through that personal experience, I've kind of come to this general perspective that you actually can talk about these things, these really hot button culture war type things, and kind of take a stand and critique. But I mean, it is a very delicate project, and being able to show how you are engaging some of these same values or empathizing with a particular ideology, worldview, what have you, sort of prior to then deconstructing it a little bit is very helpful, and it really tones down the reactivity of the situation and allows for a much more open dialogue. So I'm hopeful that these are kinds of conversations that actually people can have more productively. I think I'm just kind of lucky to have a certain disposition that lends itself to that sort of project, and that's probably true of you as well. But certainly these are tools and techniques that can be more explicitly disseminated and taught to folks, so that there are easier alternatives for talking about certain issues.
Yeah, well, that is what I make a living doing. But I'm curious, how about for you personally, like in terms of your kind of ideological label or descriptor, how would you describe how you orient yourself to politics, not only in terms of the content, but also in terms of those kind of meta qualities that you were talking about? Like, how do you think about your own relationship to your ideology, or your own kind of self-awareness around your political
Yeah.
sense making, so to speak?
Right. Yeah, I think I'd probably call myself ideologically promiscuous, to be a little goofy about it. But I mean, a more conventional term would be eclectic. I think I probably have some kind of central orbit around some form of liberalism, in the classical sense, but also drawing a bit on progressive liberalism as well. But I have certain Marxist sympathies and more socialist kinds of leanings at times as well. I think class analysis can be very useful, and I see a lot of utility in some of those larger frameworks of analyzing capital and creating a kind of workers' movement, those sorts of things. I'm not a dyed-in-the-wool communist by any stretch of the imagination. My familiarity with Marxism is pretty surface level, all things considered. I like sort of left anarchism quite a bit. I think there's some really good resources there that aren't dissimilar from some of the classical liberal stuff in terms of kind of ground up community culture building and sort of having that as the sort of top of the mind sort of politically, rather than this kind of more electoral type of process. There's forms of traditional conservatism, like what Roger Scruton presents, that I think are quite compelling, looking at the kinds of virtues and the value and depth of cultural traditions that sort of create a people and a nation. I think those aren't things that can be so easily disregarded by some of the more progressive liberal or leftist types. So I think that's a helpful tool in the toolbox as well. Yeah, I think that's probably most of my sympathies. There's a libertarian streak in there as well, that I think can be helpful at times. Always good to remain somewhat critical of state power, even as it might really actually be what is the most helpful solution for a given problem. But so, yeah, I have no idea how to self-label with all of that. So I can certainly lay it all on the table in a conversation like this. But I don't really feel much of a need to have some kind of discrete political identifier. Can just talk about things. So
Yeah, that's awesome. So sounds very meta-ideological, if I may say so myself.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about the traditional conservative stuff, because that's something that, I've always been very interested in. I think, given my upbringing and now looking back, what I could consider actually a very conservative, traditional, Japanese, Confucian, Buddhist family and Buddhist temple and community in Hawaii, where I think a lot of the members definitely adhere to a very traditionalist worldview, both kind of a Japanese cultural worldview that has its own set of values, very Confucian in origin, and also the Buddhist part of that, right? Especially the Zen tradition, which to me has a lot of, the kind of emphasis on like a discipline, and it can almost be very like masculine and militaristic form of spirituality, right? All the training and it's called the shugyo in Japanese, right? And it's this like grit, this kind of stoic character building, enduring, you can kind of like bear the suffering and then through the training and develop a kind of strength through that. It's very samurai kind of, culturally and spiritually, right? So like that's always kind of been a part of my cultural DNA. And so exploring the Western conservative tradition, which I think has much more of an overlap with like monotheistic Western religion, which is kind of new to me and very exotic and foreign to me, given I grew up in a Buddhist family. But that's something I've been exploring in more intensively over the last several years, and kind of wrapping my own head around, what is really at the heart of this critique, right? What is really here? And of course, there are the kind of conventional tropes surrounding, like, trying to preserve good things, and there are all of these different ways of conceiving what the values or what are the gems that should be extracted from these traditional perspectives are, right? So I'm curious for you, like, let's just kind of riff on that. Like, what is really at the heart of it for you, both in terms of how these insights benefit you personally, and also why, as a society, these are perspectives that are worth considering.
Yeah, there's a lot there, certainly, but yeah, let's dive in. So I don't really have that kind of religious conservatism or even cultural conservatism in my sort of DNA, so to speak. I grew up in what I would say is a culturally Lutheran setting, so religion did not play a heavy-handed role and lead to particularly sort of hardline conservative viewpoints. ELCA Lutheranism itself is quite a progressive denomination of Christianity. So it's certainly a different flavor than, say, certain kinds of Missouri Synod Lutheranism, which are going to be more conservative, or even Catholicism, Orthodoxy, these sorts of traditions. But when I really started studying religion in depth in college, that's when I kind of started to see some of these perspectives and see the value in what you could broadly construe as a traditional worldview. That started being much more along sort of spiritual and religious lines for me, but obviously those aspects of life are not disconnected from more practical things such as politics, culture, these sorts of aspects. So yeah, I mean, I think you can get a very cohesive and sort of magisterial type of political worldview, sort of grounded within the context of traditional religion. Everything kind of fits together. I mean, one of the things that's unique about religion as sort of a sociological phenomenon is that it is this sort of holistic life orientation. It's at least traditionally understood. Whereas something like politics even kind of has its own domain, and there's things that are separate from it. But a truly traditional religion, it's going to touch on your sort of a personal inner life, your family, cultural aspects, political aspects, governance, economics. Everything is sort of related to this category. So starting there for a worldview and sort of the political aspects of a worldview, you end up with something that is very holistic and integrated. And I think that's very compelling for a lot of people in our contemporary time, where a lot of things are very fragmented. And personally, I don't use that as some kind of negative value judgment, but a lot of people feel that way about this. So they can gravitate towards traditional religion as something that feels much more grounded, much more stable. And rightly so. I mean, these are things that have histories that are hundreds or thousands of years old. There's a lot of depth and wisdom and just resources within something that's been around that long and had to deal with so much historically. So I think there is a lot to be gained from grounding oneself in traditional religion and really engaging with all that a tradition can provide. Where I sort of start to get a little bit uncomfortable is when this goes beyond just a sort of a personal quest of sort of finding resources for one's own life, and you really get some of these big narratives that set up tradition and modernity as these kinds of oppositional categories. And often then what could just be a personal project of finding wisdom and insight and deep philosophy can get really fascistic really quickly. So there's a lot of young religious converts, especially in Catholicism, Orthodoxy, certainly the Muslim world as well, who end up getting really enmeshed in these kind of big narratives about tradition and modernity. And now suddenly you have a bunch of sort of sincere advocates for theocracy in our contemporary scene, which to the average person is going to seem very far-fetched, very unappealing. Certainly it's very far removed from liberal sensibilities, but it's my contention that the sort of leap from simply finding a lot of resources and value in traditional religion to these sorts of big narratives, it's not a logically necessary leap. In fact, this whole sort of move of identifying as traditionally religious is only something that kind of makes sense in the context of modernity, where you've already set up this kind of opposition of modernity as something entirely foreign or oppositional to tradition. So really, you're kind of already in this dialectic that is kind of making you do some interesting moves that are going to have you renouncing sort of large swaths of modern human thought, which in fact also is tradition and has a lot of resources. So it's going to put you in a very reactive position if you end up going down that road. But so my preference is, just be religious. You don't need to have this narrative of tradition versus modernity. There are plenty of people just being normal religious people nowadays, just like they always have been. And even in any age of history, religion was sort of dynamically interacting with the developments of its day. Certainly you have things like Neoplatonism in the early history of Christianity that sort of infused into the thinking of the religion. And then that developed just into what was Christianity. And these traditional people would consider that tradition, and that is sort of a fine development. And then later with Thomas Aquinas integrating a bunch of Islamic theology into the tradition via Islamic philosophers and theologians like Ibn Rushd. Again, that's tradition to these people. But suddenly, when we're in modernity, that project is called off for some reason. And it's because this oppositional category has already been sort of implicitly called upon in people's minds. But why do you got to do that? Huh? You don't need to, actually. So I think having this dynamic relationship between one's religious tradition and these traditional sources and anything that is foreign or novel is going to be the much more healthy and robust way to move forward with the sort of conservative resources of a tradition that can talk in deep ways about values and such, while not getting not renouncing all these other resources that hey, I mean, human beings have been thinking about some pretty helpful and interesting stuff these past couple hundred years. So don't want to just offer some blanket condemnation of that. They might have some very important things to say, in fact.
Do you know the book called Triumph of the Therapeutic?
I don't think so.
Okay, that it's considered a conservative classic. It was written by a guy named Philip Rieff, R-I-E-F-F, in like the 60s, I think, or 70s. That is, to me, one of the most interesting books I've read on conservative theory that to me really gets to the heart of, for me, my personal appeal to kind of conservative, traditional, and a lot of religious stuff included too in Rieff's analysis, right? Where his contention is that the modern psychological paradigm, and now I guess with the onset of kind of like wokeism or whatever, you can say kind of a sociological paradigm, basically deconstructs this notion of like character and virtue and morality that's gained in a traditional religious communal setting, and it's replaced by this notion of like catharsis, which started with Freud. So the cathartic paradigm is, I have some kind of trauma, I have some kind of problem, and I need to kind of like just let it out and I'll feel better, right? Like I'm gonna go to a therapist and I'm gonna explore myself. And then I'm gonna like release the negative emotions and kind of just like shake it off and then continue on my life. The impulse is kind of like towards, it's not an impulse of cultivation and building, right? It's not an impulse of like, how do we build stronger, virtuous moral character? It's more of a, how do I like get rid of things. I'm not articulating this very well, but it's something, it's a distinction I can feel kind of somatically, right? And I've always felt like this whole notion of like character development, which I think is front and center to a lot of people, like in the Buddhist temple that I grew up in. And what does it take to build character, right? And part of it is dealing with adversity, right? So dealing with adversity and stretching ourselves and challenging ourselves is how we build character and we become stronger individuals. And this whole thing has a very, right now, a very Jordan Peterson-esque flavor, right? But I do feel like a lot of people are missing this element, this dimension in our mainstream conversation around trauma, around healing, around psychological growth and so forth, where we might talk about developing different skills to self-regulate. But this whole language, right? Guys like, I'm sure you know, Alistair McIntyre, After Virtue, he's critiquing this whole paradigm and saying we've lost the language to talk about morality and virtue and character, and religion and religious cultures give us the language and the kind of ecosystem of memes and concepts to put that front and center. And that if we lose that, we're going to lose our ability to grow a strong individual. So what I call my favorite part of the conservative critique is what I call the promotion of anti-narcissistic self-cultivation. How do we cultivate ourselves? How do we cultivate our characters and become virtuous human beings and citizens without falling into this kind of new age narcissistic, like I'm just going to hedonistically pursue whatever whim comes up in the moment. And that religion kind of gives the anchoring or the constraints with which to kind of structure your life in a way so as to militate the narcissistic traps of a more new age spirituality. And again, to me, it's even less about these concepts and more about the spirit of what I'm saying that I think a lot of people really feel like is missing with this kind of late capitalist culture of narcissism and materialism and nihilism. And how do we regain like a strong sense of moral vigor to overcome this sense of cosmological alienation that modernity has thrown ourselves into, right? So to me, that's kind of the deeper instinct that drives my interest. I'm just curious what your reflections are on what I just said.
Yeah, absolutely. I entirely empathize with what you're saying, and I get the distinction you're drawing. One way I might try and put it is I think the sort of conservative perspective, especially with its religious inflection, in its sort of robust form, is this idea that you as a person are sort of for the world. Like you are meant to bring something to this reality, and that there's this responsibility to sort of respond in ways that would be helpful and spiritually robust, and sort of respond to this situation of, in Christian language, a fallen world. There's sin and evil, and what are you going to do about that? That's quite the predicament, and you can either make it worse. You can easily make it worse, and it might feel good even, or you can sort of accept that there's sort of a deeper purpose to finding oneself in this situation, and it's that you are given the opportunity to make it better, to bring beauty and goodness into this broken world, and be a sort of a life raft for the people around you who are looking for refuge, because this world is chaos and has all sorts of shortcomings. And so it's a beautiful, evocative kind of perspective there. And I see why people can be very drawn to it in the context of this capitalist, new age, narcissistic, whatever, all these different threads coming together, where the world is for you, in a sense. The world is this place that you play out your sort of healing journey or something. You are trying to be reconciled in some way. You're this kind of main character who needs to kind of deal with and integrate some things, and what avoids pain and setbacks sort of personally in your mental health journey or whatever, Well, you don't want to have situations where you're sort of pulled backwards. You want to have this sort of healing journey. So you get here stuff like these heavy-handed notions of like emotional labor, where I might not be there for my friend because it's dragging me down. I don't want to listen to my friend's depression struggles. I have my depression struggles that this is just going to make it worse. It can, that probably is truth to that. And you do need to be kind of pragmatic about these sorts of things. But yeah, having these like reified concepts that can really be used to always sort of recenter the self as the goal in some sense, rather than the self as sort of a vehicle, a means for achieving something greater, which you see in these religious conservative paradigms. But both have their pathologies. I mean, I think ultimately we have sort of a yin and yang kind of situation here. If you're only trying to be virtuous and self-sacrifice and give to the world without really fully considering yourself and the healing you might need and the needs you might have, you do have this kind of toxic masculinity sort of thing that can develop where again, you can't sort of look at yourself in some kind of self-critical way. You're always trying to achieve for some virtuous end. But what if you're off track because of some sort of trauma that's actually guiding this? Right now, I'm rewatching Breaking Bad, and I think Walter White is kind of a good example here. He's protecting his family, he's providing for them. Oh, he's doing a lot of bad stuff, though. He is, in a sense, this sort of virtuous male conservative archetype who will stop at nothing to provide for his wife and children. But I mean, if you look at the ways his behavior is actually impacting them in a very negative way, putting them in danger, these sorts of things, you do see that, okay, actually, there's something psychological going on with him. And he's very conveniently used this frame to justify something which is ultimately being propelled by his trauma of low self-esteem and sort of not feeling powerful or good enough in life. So yeah, this is just kind of rambly reflections here, but interesting paradigms, both of these.
Totally agree. Just to put a bow on this conversation, virtue is really one of my favorite words in the English language. I love the word virtue, and that's what I really enjoy about the axial age traditions. Is all of them put front and center some notion of virtue, and have their own conception of virtue ethics, right? Whether it's the ancient Vedic Indian religion, Buddhism, Confucianism in China, Taoism, and in the West, the kind of Greco-Roman Christian theological tradition all have its own notions of virtue. I guess the traditions I know least about would be like Judaism and Islam, which I'm sure you can educate me on. But I still feel like virtue is kind of front and center, explicitly or implicitly, huge core part of these traditional religions. And I feel like we're really missing out on that in our current discourse. And what's so sad is that now when you hear the word virtue, people associate that with virtue signaling, like this really vapid, like shallow signaling for your side to make you look like you're a good person without actually being having morally substantive character, right? You're just hashtagging or memeing something that appears to have a virtuous association, but you're not really. And so like that to me is just really sad. Like when people think of the word virtue now, they just think of virtue signaling, instead of like this real ancient moral tradition of what it means to cultivate virtues, right? So I think a lot about what would a meta-ideological approach to virtue ethics be that's really updated to the 21st century, that's not a kind of toxic masculine stoicism where there's obviously room for, the latest developments in psychedelic therapy or trauma or ecstatic dance, I don't know, right? The things I would otherwise be kind of allergic to, but I think that reviving some healthy sense of virtue, but in a non-dogmatic and very fluid and very kind of diaphanous way is something I'm interested in. I haven't systematically developed what that would look like. I don't know. Maybe I'll leave it at that and just see if you have any thoughts off the cuff.
Yeah, I think virtue incredibly powerful and important, even perhaps. But yeah, I feel like even the whole sort of project of healthier dialogue or sort of cross ideological navigation itself could kind of have a virtue frame. Like it's also very pragmatic, but instead of sort of coming with these heavy-handed, preordained goals of your political project, set that aside, though not completely, for the sake of virtue, because you actually need to deal with other people, even though that's really fucking hard. And it can be very uncomfortable and requires a lot of capacity for empathy and patience and discernment as an individual. It's a lot easier to sort of deride people on Twitter for being stupid and insensitive or whatever. But that's not virtuous. It's virtuous to actually build bridges where they can be built, and to just to like contribute to a healthier culture of dialogue, of sort of yeah, just being able to interact with fellow human beings in a productive way, even in situations of ideological difference or yeah, I don't know. It's such a situation we find ourselves in. I mean, I think certainly we both have insights here that we'd love to share with the broader culture. But I mean, I still like haven't reached this point where it's like some kind of full like resolution of a perspective of what you kind of do in this situation. Like how do you deal with sort of boundary cases? Like, yeah, you don't want to sort of just kind of validate sort of Nazi fascist perspectives by sort of honoring them with good faith dialogue. It seems I take that critique very seriously. But at the same time, man, those perspectives are growing. There's a lot like coming out of those corners of the internet and creeping into sort of non-digital life in very real ways. So I mean, at the same time, you really do want to do something there, and how to make those distinctions, when to know when it's sort of past time for dialogue, and hey, maybe you want to make fun of someone's shitty ass politics. That's a tool in the toolbox too, but you got to be discerning about when to use it, and knowing when to just sort of shut someone down or denounce someone's perspective rather than going for dialogue. It's hard, and I think maybe right now a virtue perspective is kind of the best you have there, because it doesn't give you some kind of final answer, final heuristic about here's where you do this, here's where you do that. It's always sort of this evolving, responsive process and responsibility in each situation as they arise. So yeah, I think that's about where I've gotten with some of this stuff. So and I thank you for certainly all your contributions to my own thinking in terms of these things.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think implicit in my work, there is a kind, at least the people who are drawn to, it's like some of the workshops I teach or the communities I'm a part of, I think implicitly there is a sense of like engaging with this kind of work, however difficult it is to deal with really polarized communities or relationships, and looking at our own biases and blind spots and limitations and perspective, and letting go of our own strongly held opinions when it's warranted, right? That there is a kind of virtue in that, right? Whether it's cultivating humility or charitability or compassion and empathy for people you vehemently disagree with, there is a kind of civic virtue to at the collective level that emerges from this kind of community of practice, right? So I do think that's something I want to highlight more. I still haven't felt totally comfortable making that explicit, because even I still have a slightly uncomfortable reaction thinking about talking about virtue explicitly, like going into the corporate world and be like, let's talk about virtue. Like people, what the hell are you talking about? So I tend to approach it actually more implicitly, like, Jared, tell me someone that you really respect and why you respect them and what is it about them that you really respect. Like, let's have that as the opening go around, right? Or another good question would be like, tell me someone who, like a wise person who's really formed, and shaped you as a person. That's really been a benefit to you. Like what does that look like, and who was that person, and how did they help you, right? That's where. So like these kind of questions can tease out people's implicit notions of virtue and then create a space to talk about them. And I really enjoy cultivating that atmosphere, right? This is just a totally weird random thought, but like for my job, I read the entire 180-page manifesto of Peyton Gendron, the Buffalo shooter. And it was crazy, and it had tons of racist shit and memes, and just it really was kind of like a mentally ill, like racist Reddit 4chan, like all of the worst memes piled into a document combined with a whole bunch of like neo-Nazi talking points. One of the things that I find very interesting about these guys is that, and especially like these Nazi communities I've been kind of like tracking, is that their whole worldview is, aside from the racist memes and stuff, it's very mythological. Like they live in this highly mythologized world where they have a very mythologized view of this golden past of like purity, of racial purity that never existed. And if only we can return there through violent and glorious means of purging the invaders and recurring. It's very fascistic, right? It's this theme of cyclical renewal, that society has become corrupted and sick and needs to be radically purified through violent methods against the other. And there's so much symbolism that actually is contained in their worldview, and there's a lot of Christian symbolism. There's a lot of like European tradition symbol, like like Richard Spencer's ads where he has like the sword and it's like this medieval knights, and there's a real draw to these ancestral roots and qualities. And I was like, I don't feel like a lot of these guys are amenable to rational discourse, right? But working with the symbolism on its own terms could be fruitful as a kind of psychotherapeutic psychotechnology to like unleash on them to get them out of their racist worldview. And I had a weird intuition about doing some kind of like Jungian analysis on neo-Nazis. Like if you're so enraptured in this kind of mythological symbolic world, I don't know if talking to you as if you're a rational human being is really going to work, but we can work with those energies on their own terms. And I don't know if that backfire or if it would be successful, but that's just things I've been thinking about. Like, what would be the right tool to really, because this is really a growing problem. And through the internet, people are going to be exposed to all kinds of things, and we can't shut that down. We can't shut down the information streams, right? But how do we kind of build people's immune systems to prevent radicalizing to extremist violence? And for the right, I really think a lot about like kind of the Jungian archetypal approach to really work with those raw primordial symbolic energies. That's a totally weird thought that I had. It's the kind of thought that someone would have when doing like mushrooms. But what do you think about that idea?
I think it's probably pretty spot on. Yeah, I think certainly this good faith debate paradigm is one of many tools, and not always the best suited. But that doesn't mean the only other option is sort of deplatforming or kind of crude ad hominem types of responses. Working at that mythic, symbolic, pre-rational kind of level is probably very important. I've certainly thought along similar lines recently, and I wonder how you could sort of turn some of these fascistic values like against themselves, and how that could perhaps be effective. One of this sort of classic memes of this ideology, I'd say, is this strong men create good times create weak men create bad times create strong men. This cyclical, as you're saying, kind of thing. And I mean, the focus here is certainly a virtue one on strength of men, masculine strength. And I wonder what would happen if you took that value, that virtue, and tried to sort of turn it against Nazism, fascism, these kinds of things, like just this very like, wow, you need this this goofy larpy mythic shit to be virtuous in life. What a weak dude you must be to need such a fantasy playtime sort of ideology. I mean, of course, that is kind of in this sort of ad hominem type of mode, but I don't know. It could at least allow for some kind of real alchemy with some of these sort of paradigms and value tropes that exist in these communities. So I'd be interested to see what kinds of reactions you'd get if you kind of consistently like turned these values against these folks. Like, oh, you want purity and stuff, and I don't know how you turn that one around yet, but I think there's a lot of potential value there. You want purity and you're stuck in these internet communities, and what are you putting in your body, by the way? These sorts of things. I think
Right.
yeah, some potential there. It'd be interesting to see.
Yeah, one thought that came up is like what you're referring to is what I call mimetic jiu-jitsu, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one that came up to me was, the phrase that guns are the great equalizer. And there's actually an evolutionary argument that it was the evolution of projectile weapons that actually spurred human cultural and civilizational evolution, because projectile weapons allowed a bunch of beta males who otherwise didn't have the strength to take out an alpha male, right? So you could be 10 times as strong as me and be an MMA champion, but if I have a pistol, I can just take you out. So it's like, well, if you're such a strong guy, then put away the guns and let's brawl in the street. Like, I have a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, was 2-time Hawaii, super flyweight boxing champion. Let's see what you got, right? So that's like, let's take away the equity aspect, which is the firearms, and see what this can do, right? No, I'm kidding. But I do believe that anything, yeah, there is a place for like shit talking, good faith shit talking, right, to kind of provoke someone into questioning their beliefs and stuff. So anyway, that's kind of an aside, but yeah, so going back to the whole traditional thing before we went on this weird tangent, another thing I think a lot about too that I find very, very meaningful, very important, very salient for a lot of conservative traditional thinkers is a return to ontology, right? A return to the ontological, which they feel like, and I think this critique is right on, has really been deconstructed both by modern forms of kind of empiricism or, like the analytic school of philosophy, that kind of brackets ontological claims in favor of empirical data, or even postmodern deconstructive methods that are more likely to reduce ontological, or in the case of religion, cosmological notions to systemic socio-historical ones, right? And so there's a hunger I think in the collective consciousness to really return to some kind of ontological ground of being, some kind of rootedness, right? And this kind of gets back to the fascist thing as kind of being a toxic and destructive manifestation of this instinct to return to the homeland, right? It's the blood and soil, right? It's this kind of sacred home world that we can root ourselves into as a people and as a civilization, and that modernity has deracinated us from these roots, and that we need to return to some kind being rooted in something real, and not just deconstructed into this nihilistic nothingness that's become the the norm, right, in the kind of postmodern age that we live in. And so, and this kind of, I think, can kind of segue to our conversation on hyperobjects that we're supposed to have. But just starting with the kind of rebirthing, right, the revivification of the ontological. I'm wondering what you think of that as kind of a core tenet of the conservative impulse, maybe in stark contrast to the left's tendency to try to epistemologize false notions of the ontological, which is kind of the critical theory tradition, right? We're replacing false consciousness, false notions of reality with critical consciousness, and interrogating our biases and blind spots about reality, but we're still not going directly to reality, right? And the conservative tradition is, how do we go directly to reality? We're like the red pill metaphor, right? Where Neo is awakening from the matrix into the real world. And so you're actually taken directly, you're put in touch with reality directly, and getting out of the kind of conceptual or the epistemological or thinking about reality. So I see that as a big part of, especially like the Catholic natural law tradition, right? Where there really is a real kind of invisible moral landscape that is eternal and cosmic and that transcends human arbitrary creation, right? And how do we root into that? And so that's something I feel like is a big part of this compulsion toward, and that could manifest in a very destructive way or in a very helpful way, but we better do it consciously so it doesn't manifest in a destructive way.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful typology here. Yeah, I mean, certainly much more conservative or traditional thinking is ontological and essentialist. And in reaction to this contextualizing impulse of the more postmodern and leftist standpoints, they have sort of reified these things even more. And this is where you get, I mean, race ideology that looks at different sort of ethnic cultural groups as very clearly delineated and having some essence to them. And so that's not good. Doesn't end well usually from what I've seen. But I think the people who are doing all this epistemologizing and relativizing, they're not off the hook. They are leaving people hanging pretty seriously. But again, maybe you're weak if you are feeling like you really need solid ground. But I think that there's probably a healthier way forward than sort of either of these approaches and their excesses. So I think taking the sort of contextualizing, epistemologizing perspectives very seriously is important. There's certainly people who try and kind of renounce those in a little too harsh of ways from my perspective than what is really warranted in trying to sort of get beyond these perspectives. So yeah, I don't know. I think and I think this does tie into the object-oriented ontology stuff probably, but being able to not get lost in contextualism, but seeing that sort of position is sort of an important way in which ontology is sort of characterized or colored in certain ways. I think that's probably important. So yeah, not just sort of denouncing that ontology is sort of some fantasy or inachievable, or that everything's social constructs or whatever, which never sat very well with me. But being able to say, yeah, there's probably some ontology. Who knows exactly the extent to which we can contact it? It's certainly not unmediated at all. But certainly in our specific setting within our social group and our norms and the natural environment and political situation, it seems that ultimately, with all these things hanging together, we kind of get this sort of picture of ontology, which let's work with that explicitly then. And not try and do away with it. And yeah, it's again like kind of where we started this conversation. If you try and reject ontology entirely, you still end up with some kind of ontological perspective, but you're always looking through it and you can't look at it. So being able to look at your ontology and realize you're always in ontology. I think that's probably the more pragmatic, the more virtuous road forward here.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about hyperobjects, because I think I wrote up a little paper that I sent you on some initial thoughts, some kind of constellating thoughts on MIP, and part of the paper included a section I called hyperobjects and hypocognition, right? And the idea is that there are these hyperobjects. Actually, let me stop for a second. So maybe you can explain for the audience, what is a hyperobject?
Yeah, so a hyperobject, this is a philosophical concept developed by the philosopher Tim Morton, who is in this tradition, object-oriented ontology, which is a realist philosophy that considers itself non-modern. And one way to kind of think about how this ontology works is that it kind of universalizes Kant's divide of phenomena and noumena. So in sort of the classical Kantian perspective, you as a human being have this sensuous experience of phenomena, which appear to you in a certain way because of your sort of a priori constitution as a human being that gives you the qualia that you experience. And so there's this kind of fundamental divide between this numinous world out there and then your phenomenal experience, which is colored by your sort of specific existence as a human being. So there's this singular ontological divide that happens between the human and the non-human, basically. So object-oriented ontology said Kant was basically right about that. Like, we do only experience things phenomenally. We can't experience the things in themselves directly, but that's not only a human situation, that is the ontological situation for all objects. So not only other living beings, so say a fish has its own fish phenomenal experience that's going to be different from a human being's phenomenal experience because it's a fish and not a human being. The sort of a priori way that things are translated from the sort of noumenal to the sensual is different. Even something like a book has a sensual encounter with reality that sort of gives it only a phenomenal encounter that is itself uniquely colored by its bookness. And it's this flat ontology, so you don't discriminate or reduce things to sort of components or their relationships. So something like a Beethoven symphony is as ontologically real and as much of an object as, say, the Civil War, as is, say, the marriage between two people, as is rocks, as is exoplanets. All these things are objects, and there's certain sort of fundamental ways that they interact and behave with each other. So that's a kind of brief overview of triple O or OOO as it's abbreviated.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, the Kantian part I think is important to underscore because Kant famously said, and I love this phrase so much, perception without conception is blind, right? And he was really the philosopher to really bring forth these abstractions or the a priori categories of the intuition that structure incoming sense data without which you would not be able to make sense of reality in any kind of coherent way, right? That there are actually these kind of invisible forces that a priori structure how you make sense and interact with reality, right? Like these categories like time, number, what was the other one? Space, right? There are these different factors. So to me, MIP really contains that kind of this kind of Kantian component where when it comes to seeing socio-political systems, let's not fall into this kind of naive political realism, right? Where we believe we can go right to political objects or events in themselves. They're always going to be scaffolded or determined by the ideological frames, implicit or explicit, that we're operating from, right? And so my idea of connecting that with hyperobjects is that I noticed that, well, first let me say that a lot of the depolarization work and that different communities are doing, like Braver Angels or any kind of organization that's trying to bridge divides, they focus a lot on values and working with people's values, right? Like you're a conservative, I'm liberal, we have different values. Let's explore the values, maybe explore how we might have the same content of values but express them differently in the political realm, right? I noticed that was insufficient to really get to the heart of certain divides, and that the real divide is actually ontological, not axiological, right? That people are positing different hyper object phenomena that are basically the other person either doesn't believe in or cannot see. And the fact that you can't see that this large hyper object, whether climate change is a classic example, right? Like if you don't believe in climate change, you're a climate denier. And being a climate denier means that you're blind to the hyper object that I think is the most dangerous to the world. And we can't garner the political will to deal with it because you're blind to X hyper object. So it's like, okay, let's try to instead of just saying what hyperobjects are real and what hyperobjects are not real, which obviously gets very loaded really quickly, like is systemic racism real, right? Let's just cycle through various frames or augmented reality lenses that can make hyperobjects visible to us, right? That disclose hyperobjects, and then play with them. And so instead of going directly to the hyperobject, let's try on different lenses that illuminate the hyperobject. So that was kind of my attempt to bring in this kind of component of ontological play or ontological fluidity by starting with the epistemology and experimenting with how that enables us to see a certain hyperobject that we would have otherwise missed or overlooked without the lens. Right. So in that paper, that was what I was trying to get at. But I think what you were saying was there were a couple of nuances or key points about hyperobjects that I missed out on or didn't include or maybe misunderstood. So I'm wondering if you kind of clarify that for me right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing that jumped out to me was sort of the metaphor of sight that was kind of operating in your definition of hyperobjects. I think you said something like hyperobjects, something that exists, but you can't perceive all of it, or something like that. Object-oriented ontology would hold that that is true for absolutely every object. Every object is only partially perceptible through this sensuous filter. It always has withdrawn aspects that are inaccessible to us. And not only through perception, but through sort of physical touch. That's another mode of access for objects. So everything is always mediated for triple O. What makes hyperobjects kind of unique in Morton's theorizing from every other kind of object is that they are dispersed over sort of vast swaths of time and space. So they're a lot harder to sort of localize. One other feature here, which is also true for all objects, but I think is especially important for hyperobjects, is they are composed of other objects. An object is made up of many other things that are, again, these objects that create something are only partially accessed by the sort of emergent object. So the triple O people like to say the parts are greater than the whole, sort of against that classic aphorism. And so, yeah, it makes for this very interesting approach to these sort of large scale phenomenon. One of the things that Morton says, which is really interesting, is that hyperobjects are actually very ontologically weak because they have all these disparate parts and components that are kind of drawn together that it's kind of hard for them to hang together in a certain sense. And so one of the things that Morton tends to suggest as sort of responding to hyperobjects is to try and access them in different ways. So for climate change, not trying to get caught in these sort of ecological moralizing modes, but what would sort of joy or playfulness in climate change look like? And certainly any given sort of interaction of oneself with a specific ecology or weather, you're not, I mean, climate change is pervasive. It's this hyperobject that we are totally caught up in, but we're also like interacting with very local things that are not reducible to climate change. So how can we live sort of joyously in ecology, like despite climate change or because of climate change or within climate change? And so I think that is probably very helpful in this Meta-Ideological project as well. What kinds of other modes of relationship can we have with these ideological hyper objects, whether it be systemic racism or sort of virtue, tradition, these big categories, because it's easy to get caught in these modes that people in various ideologies say you have to kind of engage with systemic racism, say in this like deeply moralized, sort of sincere, emotive, visceral apologetic almost kind of way. What are other ways to sort of engage in this hyper object of systemic racism, and how could these ways sort of hijack the kind of ontological weakness of systemic racism? How can you fit joy in as an access mode for this? Because systemic racism is a great example. It's spread out. It's this object spread out amongst political institutions, prisons, history textbooks. All these different things are hanging together, and so it's loose though because of that. And so there's points for exploiting that in interesting ways.
Yeah, that's great. So let me go back to what you're saying about the metaphor of sight. So were you saying that the metaphor of sight might not be the most fitting because of how dispersed through time and space the hyperobjects are, or what were you saying about that exactly?
Yeah, so it's not sort of definitive for hyperobjects. So no object can be sort of reduced to perception. That's kind of one of the fundamental insights of the object-oriented folks. So yeah, hyperobject, it's ontologically weak, dispersed over large swaths of time and space. It has as its sort of parts a lot of other objects. That's more the kind of definitive characteristics of a hyperobject in particular versus objects in general, which can't be fully accessed by perception or any other mode of access because of this ontological divide that exists for O.
Totally. Yeah, and they need to be comprehended by abstraction, right? Because you can't see all of the like you can see little bits and pieces, like with climate change, right? You can see like rising temperatures, you can see like, you know, sea level, you know, whatever. I don't know all the science about like what goes into climate change, but you can't actually see the entire phenomena all at once.
Yeah, but that is true for all other objects too. They'll always be mediated by something or another that can be thought abstractions or sort of immediate perceptions or some kind of other object that comes in to mediate, like say an instrument mediates between a human being and music to actually sort of engage the object of, say, what's on the sheet music. So yeah, that's again something that's kind of universal for objects. But yeah, in terms of abstractions, I don't know if that is exactly how Morton would look at hyperobjects, because they're ontologically real, so they aren't just human kind of constructs that are overlaid onto some external reality. But I don't know that Morton would even kind of like the idea that you engage with hyperobjects through abstractions. I think that's maybe the problem for Morton, that we try to fit these ontologically huge things into these abstractions, and then like because of that we feel so overwhelmed, like what can you do about climate change? We're trapped in this huge catastrophe and trying to like only think about it globally, and you lose the ability to navigate more locally and look at the different parts of this hyperobject in sort of dynamic ways and come to new modes of relationship, and not get sort of caught in this dialectic of sorts of this hyperobject being so massive, oh, I can't do anything. So yeah, I think abstraction might have more of a negative valence for these theorists.
Yeah, very interesting. So maybe abstraction is not the right word, but we can discuss this in real time. So I'm thinking about abstraction in terms of, let's take systemic racism, for example. It's another kind of polarizing concept that a lot of people don't believe is a real thing. So this is where kind of the ontological divide is, right? I believe systemic racism is a real thing, and you don't believe systemic racism is a real thing. So screw you, right? You're complicit in systemic racism, or you're a climate denier, or you don't believe in the rampant fake news and conspiracy and whatever that's infected our system. So you're a sheep, right? Whatever angle you want to come from, or you don't believe in great replacement theory. So you're the enemy, right? So some of these are real, some of these are not real, but like, or to varying degrees, right? Or have different ontological weight. But let's go to systemic racism as an example. So someone might say, yes, there are instances in which the system might disproportionately discriminate against certain racial groups over others, or that there might be ripple effects from history of very explicit acts of racism that are still playing a role today, right? That these kind of emanations from history are definitely still contributing to inequalities between groups and so forth. But the skeptic would say, you can see all these one-off parts of it, but I still don't believe that there is this mysterious magical thing in the ether called systemic racism. In the same way with climate change, sure, the temperatures have gone up over the last 10 years, and sure, ocean levels have risen a little bit, and sure, their extreme weather patterns might be on the rise as a on the average, but I still don't believe in this abstraction of climate change, right? That's kind of where I'm using the word abstraction. Like I can see the parts, but I can't see the whole that arises from the parts that is the hyperobject. So that's where I see where a lot of the misunderstanding of the divides come up, is because people will concede that they'll see the bits and pieces of said hyperobject, but they don't believe in the emergent entity of the hyperobject as a whole.
Yeah, I think what Morton would partially want to say here is that one of the problems, maybe because of hyperobjects being sort of ontologically weak, is they are hard to access. They are more abstract than the average object. But that's actually kind of okay. Getting caught in, oh, you need to believe in systematic racism as this kind of whole, or climate change as this kind of whole, is one of the big stumbling blocks, probably. And of course, it's still useful to have these kinds of analyses. But I mean, if you're only focused on sort of this overarching hyper object, and that's sort of where your ability to engage with others sort of lives or dies, that's kind of a hard position to be in. So I think you're probably actually on the right track in that regard. Being able to have more nuanced relationships with the hyper object doesn't actually require that you sort of profess kind of faith in the hyper object in some way. You can probably engage with someone in a productive way who doesn't fully buy the systematic racism narrative, in a way that you don't get caught on trying to bring them into sort of your orthodoxy or something, and you can instead work a little more pragmatically and politically. But that might be a bit more my interpretation. One of the things I know Morton does say about the triple O perspective broadly is, by having this flat ontology where things are not sort of granted ontological priority over one another, all sort of choice kind of becomes political, in a sense, and not in sort of the human political domain, but choosing to have solidarity in various ways. You don't have this ontological crutch to sort of lean on that kind of justifies it along sort of rational lines. So, for example, let's see if I can think of anything. Yeah, I mean, like a sort of a natural law kind of perspective gives you this scaffolding that allows you to justify certain perspectives over others as rational, for like abortion or something, whereas triple O does not give you those resources. You sort of have to kind of be out on your own. You're hanging a bit, and you are then on the hook for your kind of political allegiances with sort of non-human objects and other human beings, certainly. So yeah, that's kind of an interesting aspect to the theory that might have some relevance here.
Yeah, totally. Have you ever studied Roy Bhaskar's critical realism?
I have not, no.
Okay, I was talking to Bruce Alderman a little bit about hyperobjects and Bhaskar's critical realism, which Bruce draws a lot from in his own work on post-metaphysical spirituality. And he made a really helpful distinction for me that I'm trying to wrap my head around to integrate into all of this, which is the distinction between a hyperobject and a demi-reality. So so he described a demi-reality, which is a concept from Roy Bhaskar. Demi-reality is kind of like a pseudo hyperobject. It's more like an egregore that emerges as a result of a supposed hyperobject being ideologically co-opted, but it still does have its own. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, a la Thomas theorem in sociology, right? People start behaving and treating it as if it's real, so it kind of becomes real, even though it may not be like as real or ontologically strong as like a climate change or something, right? So one example would be the great replacement of white people or European ethnic people, by hordes of invading brown people. That notion is a kind of demi-reality that drove Peyton Gendron, who shot up a bunch of black people at that Buffalo supermarket. But in terms of like, you know what I'm saying? Like we can't, like calling that a hyper object and placing it on the same moral and ontological footing as like a climate change feels a little weird. So that's where Bruce is like, let's play with this idea of a demi-reality, right? A kind of egregorically, ideologically hijacked hyper object that becomes kind of real based on a lot of people believing in it. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that distinction.
Yeah, I think sticking with the triple O perspective, they would probably reject that kind of characterization and say that a hyperobject is still, or even just a normal object is still what's going on. The fact that the human aspect in some sense kind of co-creates the sort of emergent object, that's not really kind of ontologically like important, because there's not this kind of hard ontological distinction between the human and the non-human. So for example, the great replacement theory hyperobject, yeah, I mean, that's just as much of a hyperobject as the climate change example is, but perhaps the human component is playing a more significant role, and it's more it's drawing more on this purely cultural, sociological, ideological dimensions of human beings, rather than these sort of actual migration patterns and real sort of demographic shifts, these sorts of things. But those kinds of like looking at demographic shift versus sort of ideological perspectives, there's again not a sort of ontological a priori distinction between those. So yeah, I think it would still fit in the hyperobject category, but yeah, it would include sort of more of the human aspect of it than climate change, which does include largely non-human aspects as important in terms of causation anyways. But certainly you can't have the hyperobject of climate change without the human element either, which is again why it's kind of ontologically weak. Like I mean, we could literally just stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow. I mean, that's not pragmatically going to happen, but it does show that this isn't some just out there kind of problem. It really is this really relational human being kind of issue. So yeah, the fact that there aren't these ontological distinctions, again, it gives this political dimension to all sort of ontology and your sort of allegiances. So we can't just sort of go, this is was a demi-reality, and this is a hyperobject, therefore I'm going to get rid of this one, I'm going to take this one seriously. Thus my rationality has spoken about these matters. You need to really get in the muck with all these issues in the triple O perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense, because one thing I told Bruce is my concern with that distinction is people would start weaponizing it, right? Like yours is a demi-reality, but mine's a hyperobject, right? Yours is like a bullshit made up delusional fantasy of mass hysteria, and mine's a real thing. But yeah, that's kind of how I was originally using hyperobjects. I think the only thing that gave me pause was rereading some of his book, and like his in the introduction when he's talking about what a hyperobject is, like all of the examples were like physical, more like physical things, or like something you'd study in the hard sciences. But I was thinking about it in terms of like the internet, or like culture, or the nation state, or yeah, whatever. And then I think it also gets a little bit more questionable because I was also using it to describe things like game theoretic multipolar traps. Like a prisoner's dilemma writ large that keeps us stuck in this kind of destructive, competitive, capitalist global system, right? Where there are strategic interdependencies between competing nation states or economies that lock each agent, each player in the game into a certain strategy that's destructive to the commons. But I don't know if that, like, is that too much of a stretch to call that a hyper object?
No, I probably don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I don't know how hard and fast of a definition this would be, but I think it's probably a useful heuristic. But I think the more an object draws on things that we would sort of traditionally consider as very ontologically distinct, the more it's probably in this hyper object terrain. So climate change, for example, draws upon ecosystems, weather, human ideology, scientific measurements and instruments, the news media communication, science education in high schools, car advertising. So like, whoa, there's like all these things that are sort of wrapped up into this one object and relating to it in various ways. So yeah, if you see that there's clearly human and non-human, large scale and small scale, all these different kinds of things that we kind of normally would divide ontologically in a more traditional frame, the more that those are all kind of coming together to participate in something that may be considered a hyperobject, I think that's probably a good clue that the thing is a hyperobject. So maybe from that perspective, looking at the Great Replacement or something comes off as a little less of a hyperobject because it really does seem more constrained to these kind of human sort of mental and ideological and communicative domains. It's a little harder to really robustly place it in the world, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, it'd still be an object, it'd just be a little different, drawing on fewer components, and then the access modes available may be a little more straightforward in that sense. So
That's another interesting kind of lens, I think, because in terms of what are the factors that are contained in the hyperobject, right? They're dispersed over a huge time and temporal, and spatial scales, but also the diversity of inputs that gives rise to them, right? So I think what you're saying too is like the Great Replacement, like it's a narrower range of factors that would give rise to that, whereas climate change, it's every institution, person, behavior, atmospheric, ecological thing that all goes into this hyper object, right? That goes into creating it or whatever. So yeah, I think that's another. It's like the range or the width, the breadth of inputs that go into leading to this emergent hyper entity.
right, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, that's what makes them hard to deal with, but also what kind of gives us a pathway forward. Because I mean, if there's so many myriad different ways to plug into this object, and we're already so immersed in it that we kind of can't step out of it, well, we can kind of be very creative with how we might interact with it. So that's kind of where I think the kind of liberative perspective of Triple O, at least with the climate change, kind of comes in. So
Cool. Awesome. Well, do you have a few more minutes? Talk about one more thing.
sure.
Cool. So I wanted to end by talking about your work or interest in like interreligious discourse. which also was something Bruce Alderman and I discussed when we interviewed him on this podcast, because I think has been a lot of great work done in interreligious discourse. And I see a lot of parallels, obviously, between that and political depolarization, which is my thing, and trying to resource insights and methodologies that have been successful in the religious arena and kind of transposing them to the political context. So I'm curious, just what has been your kind of work or exploration or interest in that, and what have you found helpful to really facilitate effective interreligious dialogue and understanding?
Yeah. So I've been pretty active in terms of interfaith stuff since my college days, and it's been interesting because having sort of a concrete, clear, discrete religious identity myself has not really sort of been there for most of that time. So it gives me kind of a weird liminal position in some of these dialogues, but it also has certainly helped enable me a strong kind of mediation ability, because I'm certainly very sympathetic to a number of different perspectives rather than being really pigeonholed into a certain one that then is very much going to color kind of how I might see other traditions. So within religion and dialogue between religion, this idea of polemics is certainly very important, and it's very common that this is the sort of mode for engagement between traditions. So you'll have Christian polemics against Islam, which shows the various shortcomings of Islam and why Christianity is the superior religion. Obviously, this is not a great starting place for helpful interfaith dialogue. It's a great way to sort of drum up enthusiasm for one's own tribe, which, hey, perhaps that has an important place. But we certainly don't want this to be the only mode of interaction available between traditions. So yeah, being able to get beyond that polemical mode and see different religions trying to achieve similar goals can be helpful, certainly. And I know Bruce talks about this as well, seeing like functional similarities between different traditions, where even though the concepts and the aesthetics, say, of something may be very different between two traditions, you can see how they functionally have a sort of a similar role within the overall religious landscape of a particular tradition. So that can be very helpful. I mean, just taking an attitude of curiosity, appreciation is very, very baseline helpful in terms of approaching different traditions. But a lot of people who are on the more traditional side of things sort of don't see much need of that kind of attitude, because, oh, my team, we have the truth. What am I going to really learn of value from this other tradition? So it can be hard to get past that that kind of sensibility, that basic exclusivist sensibility, especially in Abrahamic religions. But there aren't sort of problematic polemical orientations within other faiths as well. Those are some thoughts to kind of start off there.
Yeah, it reminds me, using the exclusivist, inclusivist, pluralist frame, kind of an argument I make for exclusivists for pluralism, which is, if you don't explore a wider range of religions or philosophies, then you can't reject them with as much force or vigor or confidence, right? Like, you can't reject something to meaningfully double down on what really does resonate with you as your path if you haven't explored all the options, right? Like, I can't double down on chocolate ice cream being my favorite flavor if I haven't tried vanilla and strawberry, right? And so it's like, even if you're in an exclusivist mindset and your goal is to just double down on one because you don't want to contaminate yourself by being religiously polyamorous, you can do that more meaningfully by dating a lot of girls first before getting married, right?
Totally. Yeah, that's a funny analogy. Yeah, I mean, being able to make sort of deeper polemics there's probably a place for that pragmatically. I can certainly make a strong Christian polemic against Islam. I can certainly make a strong Islamic polemic against Christianity, and I could do that with Buddhism against those two religions, and likewise the other way around there as well. But it's certainly not the end point you want to leave off at. But likewise, you don't want to fall into this kind of happy-go-lucky kind of ecumenism or pluralism where, oh, all our religions are really trying to do the same thing, and they're all good and right in their own way, which is something I actually do personally believe, but it's often presented in a much less sophisticated sort of mode that then is actually a barrier to this deeper dialogue that is actually very necessary. And being able to hit up against some of those hard points of disagreement is quite important, actually, because if you don't do that, then you don't know how you really should engage in those kind of breakdown situations. Like for example, there's very different perspectives on Jesus in Islam and Christianity, and in both those cases, these are sort of orthodox doctrines about the figure of Christ, rather than just sort of general religious perspectives. Like, for example, a Buddhist might have any number of perspectives on Jesus, but those aren't sort of dogmatically required by Buddhism, whereas both Islam and Christianity do have, to a certain degree, kind of hard doctrines about Christ, and they're pretty irreconcilable. They're both very positive, where Christianity views Jesus generally as the incarnation of God, fully divine, fully human, involved in salvation in some sense, crucified and resurrected, part of a trinity that three persons that express divinity in different aspects. Islam says Jesus is a very important prophet of God. He's very much not divine, still born of a virgin birth, still came to declare sort of God's word through his ministry and life, not crucified, though the Quranic verses dealing with this topic are a little bit ambiguous. So there are some scholars historically and currently who work to kind of reconcile what the Quran says with the more traditional historical account of the crucifixion in Christianity. Jesus has an important eschatological function in Islam. He's coming back and judging. So you see, there's a lot of parallels here, but some pretty important disagreements too. And this is the kind of issue that how are you going to reconcile that? That's kind of a pretty irreconcilable difference unless you're willing to go very esoteric with it and say that, well, I mean, prophecy in Islam, you have these sort of ideal human beings expressing God's word literally in Revelation. Well, in Christianity, you also have Jesus as this kind of receptacle of God's literal word. Well, maybe these aren't too different, but I mean, still, that's hard to get everyone to sort of buy into that kind of stretch from how the mainline Orthodox positions are often understood. So yeah, I think being able to figure out what to do in those cases is important. But the other insight here that I really have specifically gained from studying Islam and Christianity, especially, is that the hardest gaps to bridge are not the ones that are furthest apart, but the ones that are closest together in some sense. Like, this is a problem because both Christianity and Islam care about Jesus a lot and are talking very much parallel to one another, versus Christianity and Buddhism, they're so far apart that like the disagreements are, they don't have the same kind of visceral weight. Like a Christian could look at the Buddha again in any number of ways, just like the Buddhist could look at Jesus in any number of ways, and those could be amenable or not. But you're not kind of locked into these disagreements about kind of issues that are central for both the religions. A Christian kind of doesn't know what to do religiously about the idea of emptiness or something. It's not exactly a threat. It doesn't sort of undercut the whole Christian narrative. But when a Muslim says, "Oh, Jesus was just a prophet," that's like a direct kind of attack on the sort of core of the religion there. So I think there's probably some interesting parallels to that dynamic in the political domain, and that's probably why a lot of political infighting happens.
Yeah, totally. That's really interesting. That makes a lot of sense, though. Yeah, so I guess a couple things I want to ask you. I want to talk about a little bit about like Sam Harris's kind of whole shtick and critique. And because I think this also really parallels a lot of debate around ideology and politics. And it's this idea that the most salient variable and contributing factor to Islamic radical extremist violence is the ideology of Islam, is the Quran, and is the example of Muhammad. And so it has to do with the content of the religion, not socioeconomic conditions, not demographic shifts, not war, not history, not all of the other more socio-political, economic, systemic factors, right? But it has to do with the content of the religion. And when you look at other religious traditions like Buddhism, because or Jainism, the content is so radically different, right? Centering nonviolence and compassion, etc., that when the Chinese were, invading and torturing Tibetans, their primary concern was to not lose compassion for their prison tormentor instead of wanting to blow them up, right? So he places so much emphasis on the scriptural content as leading to, let's say, the problematic aspects. And so I'm wondering, A, like, what is your thought about that line of thinking, especially as it pertains to Islam? And two, how do you think about weighing the various causal factors that can lead to a problematic outcome? And how much weight do you put on scriptural content, and how much weight do you put on everything else?
Yeah, big questions. Yeah, so I take Sam Harris's critique pretty seriously. I don't think it's something you can easily dismiss. I don't agree with him. I think that the sort of political, historical factors are much more important than he would say. Whereas he really does want to not fully reduce down all sorts of Islamic extremism just to scriptural and sacred sources, but he views those as sort of core causal elements, and thinks that were those not present, the situation would be very different, which could very well be the case. Certainly there are resources within the tradition that can be very much weaponized for extremism. But to get to that point, the tradition itself needs to degrade quite significantly, because there are these sorts of strong interpretive paradigms and schools that would certainly restrict the kind of extremist violence that has become somewhat commonplace in modernity with regard to Islam. They would restrict those very significantly. Things like suicide bombing, or even just sort of offensive military strikes are pretty questionable. Suicide bombing is very uncontroversially prohibited by any traditional Islamic scholar. So, I mean, yeah, the resources are there, but they need to be pretty strongly decoupled from the developed tradition before they're really accessible in a meaningful way. And that decoupling has happened through a combined process of colonialism and sort like multinational exploitation of these Muslim majority countries in the third world or global south by sort of capitalist interests. So there's very important non-religious reasons why this situation has developed. But that's not to say that the Islamic tradition prior to this period of time was this like perfectly peaceful and progressive civilization in line with the kinds of values that the progressive liberals of our day would hold. But it certainly is not the kind of tradition that would encourage suicide bombing. I think the Sam Harris critique works if you're really willing to entirely denounce all religions, pretty much. Certainly looking at the historical data around sort of interreligious wars and violence, I think most historians would probably agree that the Christian world is sort of worse on that scorecard than the Islamic world. That would come as a surprise to a lot of people. But certainly things like the Protestant Reformation led to very bloody and prolonged conflicts for serious amounts of time. And there's been sectarian violence in the Islamic world as well, certainly. But yeah, it's important to be able to have a multivariable analysis of these sorts of things. But I don't know, Sam Harris, his stuff is kind of interesting. I know there's this one sort of, I think it's an afterword in one of his books or something. I've just heard him discuss it on podcasts and such, where he I think he takes some like recipe or something and tries to like spin it as mysticism. So he talks about how the salt in this recipe is symbolic of something or another, and he does this to show that like these sort of mystical aspects of a religious tradition, we can have those and we can kind of be creative with those. We don't need to bring along all this baggage of the sort of superstitious religious perspectives, but also that on the other hand, that the mysticism is very feeble. Like I can create it out of a recipe just as well as these folks could. But I think what he misses there is just the sort of like, not all symbolism is created equally. Some is viscerally compelling for people and really pulls on psychological strings. I don't think anyone, even if they were presented with his sort of recipe mysticism, like out of context, where it's obviously kind of a silly project and was kind of reading it as if it was earnest, I don't know how many people would be compelled by it. I don't think very many, but the mystical traditions within the major world religions and these scriptures and symbolism and poetic traditions, all these things, I mean, they are very compelling. I mean, look at their longevity, certainly. And then just the other kind of important historical point I would make in terms of Islam and kind of delineating sort of Islamic violence across history is just being able to situate, say, the early Islamic empire conquests that happened in this context of the age of empires that it happened in, where everyone was taking over lands. And of course, this was expressed in religious language for these Islamic conquestors. But to not sort of to look at that as like essentially driven by Islam in and of itself, versus being much more forgiving about like Genghis Khan. Like I feel like you don't hear like oh, about Mongol extremism, and of course it doesn't really exist contemporarily, but I feel like even Genghis Khan, like Westerners will kind of be like, oh, that was cool, or Alexander the Great. They're so willing to kind of set aside current moral standards and like look at this as like a cool empire, like historical kind of thing. But with Islam, that very much goes out the window very quickly. So a lot of Islamic historians will locate the sort of causal aspect of Islamic empire, not in the religion in and of itself. And an important sort of feature here also is that I mean, when these Muslims then conquered non-Muslim territory against what would be commonly believed by a lot of Fox News watching Americans, there was not really forced conversion of the populations. That was very rare in Islamic history. Certainly, religious minorities had to pay a special tax to live under the empire, but they were granted a decent bit of religious freedom by the standards of their day, and conversion happened pretty much organically within these places, especially through the Sufi mystics that sort of followed suit as these lands were taken under Islamic political control. So yeah, and I mean, a lot of the times this led to an improvement of social conditions in various ways. For its time, Islam was a progressive and forward-thinking religion, giving women a lot more rights and such. I don't think we want to limit our perspectives to these sort of early Islamic accounts of these kind of progressive values, but yeah, I think it's important context nonetheless. So that's a broad overview here.
That was great. I love the Genghis Khan double standard problem, right? Where
Yeah.
it's like it's interesting to really think about that and question that, where when something seems to be ideologically, or in this case religiously motivated as a primary driving force, or even just the justification or rationale for carrying out kind of violent genocidal actions, that has way more charge and controversy to it than someone just doing that because that's just what you do back in the days of savage empires, right?
Right.
So yeah, that's always really interesting to me. But one of the things that comes up a lot, I think, in depolarization, to kind of draw a bridge here, is like separating the culture from the content, right? So like there might be problematic cultural or social or political manifestations that have been done in the name of X ideology, but that doesn't mean we should completely throw away the ideology, right? Like just because certain people have co-opted it or misappropriated or weaponized it in a really egregious way doesn't mean that we should just completely dismiss, the actual content of what's being said, especially when it can be interpreted in a whole bunch of different ways, right? Like you can have interpretations that are completely different, or even with like the Buffalo shooter, like yeah, he was radicalized to white supremacist extremism and did something horrible, but there are a lot of other people who are also believe in the same things that he believes in and support him, but they still wouldn't actually do anything violent, right? So there's always other variables which really which influence and determine what sets people over the edge in terms of directly sponsoring violent or problematic actions. So we shouldn't just dismiss the content or the theoretical justifications for the actions.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things my Islamic studies professor in undergrad always sort of emphasized was that the sacred sources in Islam don't speak for themselves. They're always sort of presented through an interpretive lens, and that's how it always works. So when someone asks like, oh, what does Islam say about XYZ, that's not really a meaningful question. You could get a lot more specific and say, oh, what does the Maliki school of jurisprudence say about this issue in Islamic context? And someone could say, oh, Imam Malik said this, and his commentators clarified this and this point. And so, I mean, but that's different than saying, what does Islam essentially say about a certain issue? the Quran does not sort of come with an interpreter's manual that is equally authoritative. I mean, it has a lot of important pointers in terms of what might be important, and then the Hadith literature gives some clearer guidance, but that in and of itself doesn't have quite as much certainty and hermeneutic weight as the Quran itself, as the literal word of God. But yeah, so I mean, it's you gotta be willing to get kind of fine grained on these issues is basically what it comes down to. And learning the historical tradition is very important, so that you're not sort of taking the fundamentalists at their word as sort of the real bearers of the tradition and what it means. But that also doesn't mean that we wouldn't want to revise or build on the tradition. There and that's like actually a very normal perspective, because that's exactly what the tradition was doing throughout all of its history. It wasn't static. So yeah, just being willing to engage a bit critically is important, but doing so from a place that really does incorporate historical knowledge to a significant degree, and doesn't like before the fact kind of decide who is authentic interpreters of the tradition, especially as an outsider. So like there's certainly sort of progressive Islam nowadays, and there's a big Islamic modernist movement, especially in South Asia, what's today India and Pakistan, like 20th century, even late 19th century, and in other parts of the Islamic world as well. But Sam Harris would kind of reject those people as like having less authority to say what Islam truly is than either the jihadists or the more traditional folks who certainly would denounce jihad, but they have some laundry and baggage of their own, certainly by, again, progressive standards of our day. But how can he do that as an outsider and sort of say that these progressive Muslims who are living up to these standards are somehow less authentic interpreters of the tradition? I don't know that is sort of philosophically justifiable, at least on the face of it. You could make arguments, but it's going to be hard, again, from the outside, because you'd need to actually have a good understanding of how authority works in the tradition and what perspective on religious authority within the tradition, because there's more than one, is the correct perspective. So you really got to get in there and kind of inhabit it to really be able to even make those claims, unless they're kind of flimsy, very ideologically driven claims. So
yeah, absolutely, 100%. Awesome. Well, we've been going for just over 2 hours. This has been so much fun, Jared. Thank you so much for your time, and always a pleasure to talk to you. Do you have any concluding thoughts or any final kind of words on these last 2 hours?
Yeah, good question. I guess stay tuned as I develop my hyper-object meta-ideological jihadist manifesto coming down the pipes.
Looking forward to that episode when it airs. Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again. This is a lot of fun, and let's do this again sometime.
For sure.
All right. Have a good one.
Can I get a hallelujah? Can I get a